Our first scripture this morning is Matthew chapter 24, verse 32 to 35. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. Truly, I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away.
Okay. See one little crystal.
Zoom in, Rena.
I don't know how.
Go closer.
Hold on.
Just start.
You can't even see it.
Okay, go.
You can hardly see.
Okay, well, there's a crystal.
Right
It might crystallize your
It's not going to crystallize on me.
on your phone.
Ready?
Yes.
So realize this has been sitting there all year long like this. Okay.
What is it?
I'm
What
gonna
is it?
change. Huh? Well, it's water that has a huge amount of these crystals dissolved in it.
Oh.
It has so much of it that is called supersaturated. It actually is holding more salt than water actually can.
How does that work?
Because I boiled it.
You dropped it in there?
What?
Oh snap!
Oh my gosh, that's so cool!
It looks like a sea
It looks like a
Looks
puff
like a sea
ball.
urchin.
My finger ran out of Oh my god.
Oh my god.
That's so cool.
It's so
What happened to the bug?
What happens if it's still over there?
That's so
Ow.
cool.
It's still
That was
right,
just one drop.
it's right there.
One crystal.
Imagine.
Look at it extending from the bottom.
Oh, that one's racing. It's racing. Look, that one's Jeremy. He got it.
Yeah, I get there first.
Watch it break.
I want to see my nail. I want my nail to be in the picture.
Oh my gosh, Elijah, this is giving me goosebumps.
It does look kind of weird.
This is so cool. Is this real? They look like feathers.
Can we touch it?
Oh my god.
Are we gonna
Well,
pull it?
wait till it's all crystallized.
You would touch it either way, but
I
I
would.
touch radioactive things. Oh my gosh, poor Austin.
You can't see like that.
He's
Rena,
in
stop.
Korea. He's having more fun.
And may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. So our parable today has to do with the ability to read the signs of the seasons, sense the times in which you're sitting in, and then act upon what you're finding. I wonder what was the season that Jesus, in world history, into which Jesus entered. Like, what was the context in which he came? Did he just come to kind of a society that basically knew nothing of him, and then he came and he was so persuasive, so charismatic, so amazing that everybody went, whoa, let's follow this person, and he became that leader he did? Or was God preparing society for years, perhaps, before Jesus ever came? Slowly saturating that solution, so to speak, within Judaism, creating a sense of expectancy, of even perhaps urgency, perhaps creating a whole pool of people who were very much before Jesus even came, starting to really resonate with the message that he came, such that when he did come, he was acted like that bit of crystal that just showed the pattern. That's that solution that you saw didn't crystallize because it didn't have the precise pattern to follow in order to take shape. So Jesus comes in this super saturated environment where the Holy Spirit had been acting subtly and quietly for years, decades perhaps even, maybe centuries, until he formed that pattern. He showed with his life and death and resurrection a pattern that hit people in the gut, like, oh, I know that pattern. I've known that my whole life. I just have never had words to articulate. I've never known how to act in order to create that pattern. He shows me the pattern, and people act, and things happen. Things get crystallized very, very quickly. No, if I had to bet on one, Jesus just kind of being plopped in and changing everything without any preparation versus a super saturated solution, I very much believe in that super saturated solution model. Much of the time we make a mistake when we do world history, we focus on great leaders as if a leader comes and it's all up to them. They solve everything, they change everything. When really, it's about a whole movement of people to which the leader, who is critically important, because, just like that crystal, but it's really not simply about the crystal, is it? It's about the whole solution that the crystal then crystallizes. Now, Jesus was wise enough to know that probably to read this context, to interpret this context, but he also knew that whenever God is doing something aggressively for the good in the world, there's also a reaction. The world does not just stay back, passive. There is also a negative energy in the world as well. And certainly during that time of saturation, people, if you read the literature of the first century, before Jesus actually came and into the first century, what you find is a whole lot of expectation that the time was imminent, that there was a Messiah to come. And there were many people who were holding up their hands saying, I'm the one, only where Jesus is quite different from these other ones. These other ones were all saying, I'm the one, and now we are going to go into battle against the Romans. Because now the Messiah, many people felt, would come in and lead Israel to freedom through defeating those who had dominated them. And those calls, also were happening. So you have one crystal that is that is galvanizing a whole lot of people who were resonating with the Jesus message. But also what Jesus saw was the crystallization of other darker energies in the world as well, and he was concerned about that. That movement was generally known as the Zealot movement. People who honestly believed that they could conquer, with God's help, the Roman Empire. It's kind of like saying, we Nebraskans, we could defeat the United States if God is on our side. Really? Really? But that's what was the common notion. Now, just as a brief aside, I know some of you have read Reza Aslan's book called Zealot. He writes as a Muslim looking at Jesus and arguing that Jesus was part of this Zealot movement. Well, Reza Aslan, just as an aside again, has a very deep and wonderful understanding of modern scholarship on the first century, but he fundamentally does not understand Jesus in this way, that Jesus preached an anti-zealot message. In contrast to those who are saying, rise up, God will help us slay our enemies, what was Jesus preaching? Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Do good to those who are against you. This was his message time and time again. It's core to his whole identity. And of course, he's also preaching that you and I are loved beyond our wildest imagination. And he knows that we'll never actually accept that for ourselves if we can't see that other people are loved beyond their wildest imagination too, especially if we can't see our enemies. Because we all know on some level we are also enemies of God. We love God, we say we love God, so forth, but we also have these things that set us against God. And so if we can't see that God loves if we can't see God's love for our enemies, we actually can't accept God's wilder than the wildest imagination love for ourselves, because we know that there's parts of us that are actually opposed to God in the human soul. And so we never trust that message that we are truly loved until we can see that even those parts that stand against God in us and in our neighbors are embraced by a love that truly does exceed our wildest imagination. So Jesus has some words to say about what's going on, this time he's living in. Unfortunately, as time went on and memory faded, people tended to interpret these words as predictions of an apocalyptic end time, still yet to come in the future. People write about the words I'm about to give you, the words that immediately precede this fig tree parable. But he has this thing to say about his own times. It says, as Jesus came out of the temple and was going away, his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. Then he asked them, you see all these, do you? Truly I tell you, not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down. When he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately saying, "Tell us, when will this be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Jesus answered them, "Beware that no one leads you astray." Don't ask these questions. "For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Messiah,' and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place. But the end is not yet." The end is not yet. "For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom will rise against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All of this is but the beginning of the birth pangs. Then they will hand you over to be tortured, and they will put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. Then many will fall away, and they will betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because of the increase of lawlessness, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this good news of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. So when you see the desolating sacrilege standing in the holy place, as was spoken by the prophet Daniel, then those in Judea must flee to the mountains, and one on the housetop must not go down to take what is in the house. The one in the field must not turn back to get a coat. Woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath, for at that time there will be great suffering, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. Many people have read into these words signs of an apocalyptic end, but he talks about something catastrophic in which would involve the not one stone from the buildings of Jerusalem being left upon another, and saying, listen, I mean, if this was truly an apocalyptic end, like the end of everything, why is Jesus talking about what goes on after it? And if you're in the city, don't go fleeing out, or don't go. He gives a lot of advice for how to deal with something that catastrophically comes and still survive and still live on. Now, what Jesus seems to have been talking about was a future event, but a future that he already saw that would happen actually just less than 40 years after his coming. He's already seeing the signs of a building energy in his society that was quite dangerous and would lead to something quite destructive. He could already see this in the patterns and the behavior patterns within the zealot movement. What he foresaw was the fall of Jerusalem in 70 CE. When all the zealots the Romans got tired of all these insurrections, all these people raising up swords against them, claiming to be able to overthrow them. They finally got sick and tired of it. They got super saturated. And they came and they destroyed the walls of Jerusalem. They came in and destroyed the houses, the buildings, and finally destroyed the temple itself. In fact, this is the Arch of Titus. Titus was the Roman leader at the time who later became emperor, but he was the leader who besieged Jerusalem. And this is depictions of his soldiers carting away the furnishings of the temple as they destroyed it. You still see that in Rome to this day. No, this terrible cataclysm you can actually see in Jerusalem to this day as well. Those who were on the Israel trip saw that these very stones. These stones have been intentionally left there. They were the very, very stones that were thrown over the walls as the Romans toppled the city in 70 CE. They're still there to be witnessed to this day. This was the destruction that Jesus foresaw. Now, it's important to read the signs of the time and know how to act in those times. We know that in the first century there was a saturation point in which was moving people to courageous acts of love, including loving their enemies. And yet there were other voices also from those who were feeling saturated, like times must change, and they were talking about destruction of their enemies. And for some reason, when it comes to politics, how we act politically, the destruction of enemies always seems more sexy than loving the enemies. And yet we know from human relationships, like a struggle between a male and a female, or two people who are loved, destroying the other is not the solution. That's far less sexy, isn't it, than overcoming those boundaries. Loving the other side. Yeah, it may not make the newspaper headlines when you choose to love your enemies and to work through differences like this. But regardless of what makes the headlines, the times are what they are. They call for certain kinds of actions. And certain kinds of actions need to be made in and out of seasons, especially when it comes to loving our enemies.
Our second scripture for the day is Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 1 through 14. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to throw away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace, a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. What gain have the workers from their toil? I have seen the busyness that God has given to everyone to be busy with. He has made everything suitable for its time. Moreover, he has put a sense of past and future into their minds, yet they cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. I know that there is nothing better for them to be happy and enjoy themselves as long as they live. Moreover, it is God's gift that all should eat and drink and take pleasure in all their toil. I know that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. God has done this so that all should stand in awe before him.
For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. That's what our Jewish clergy friends were reminding us as we were talked about during the week, as we were talking about this parable, that there is a seasonality to life. And so we kind of think that we are the agents. We're building things and creating things, but sometimes the best way to build is actually to simply step back and see what God is already building and join in that seasonality of God in life. Just like Jesus says, like the Holy Spirit is like the wind. We feel it, we know it's coming from someplace, but we never know where it's going to come from or where it's going. There is a seasonality to how God acts with us in the world. There is a time for planting and a time for harvesting, but also a time for burning the fields and starting anew. There's time for making war, a time for making peace. The question is, for this morning, is what kind of time are we in now? What fruit is ripening on the vine of our society? Is this a time for blowing everything up? Or is this time for gathering together? Is this a time for warfare or time for peace? Certainly hear a lot of words from both ends of the political spectrum these days that talk about blowing everything up. This deep desire that society has become so corrupt, we just need to take it all, burn it down to the ground. Is this true? Or is it what needs to be burned to the ground and blown up is the very instinct to blow up and burn things to the ground? Do we need to conquer and dominate the other side so finally we can get to the true truth? Or do we need to recognize that the other side, no matter who they are, have a piece of the solution to our human crisis? That we actually can't move forward until we find those pieces within even those who we are opposed to or who oppose us. What kind of time are we living in? What fruit is ripening on our vine? As Jesus points out, it's pretty important to know these signs so you know how to respond to them. Well, I'm very thankful that you all pay me to be senior minister, as senior minister in order to be honest with you, not to simply be right. Like you don't turn to me for all the right answers, because I don't know them. So what you expect from me is honesty. But if I'm going to be honest with you, I will honestly tell you what I think, and sometimes I'll be right, and sometimes I'll be wrong. But I'll always be honest. And so I want to give you my honest reading about the times we're living in, the fruit that's ripening on our vine. Whether I'm correct or not is up to time to tell, and you can make your own decisions about that. But I at least want to tell you how I'm reading things, and perhaps you can tell me how you're reading things too, and we can compare notes and come up with a better idea together. But I think there are reasons why we are in such turmoil right now. So much chaos to the point where you can't even turn on your radio in the morning or watch TV or open the newspaper without your head just wanting to explode with rage or despair or anxiety over where we're headed. There's a reason for that, and the reason is not that something bad has come into the world that has grown increasingly bad, and that's that. To me, the reason why we're in such chaos is because in the last century, so much good came into the world that was new and different for us that has toppled the tables on our understanding of what's what. And now we're in a cycle that happens about every 500 years in Western civilization where the tables get turned and we're in a fight for hey, now what's real and what's right and who has authority, who can decide these very things. I mean, if you look at the last century, we've observed before, the first patent on record in the New York City patent office was for a paper clip, and we ended the century cloning sheep. Do you think things changed a lot in the 20th century? I mean, it makes the Great Renaissance in Europe look like child's play. And certainly a lot of bad things came into the world, but a whole lot of good came into the world. And it's just as we look back at the Renaissance and say, oh my gosh, so much good came into the world. We're still benefiting from what came into the world with the Renaissance, from science and arts and humanities and political and economic sciences that are still blessing us even now. And yet, in the Renaissance, people were not saying, oh, it's so great to be alive. I'm living in the Renaissance. No, in the Renaissance, people were freaking out. They were freaking out because all these good things were very different from the things that they were used to, and it was toppling the power structures and the people who were attached to those power structures. And so people were freaking out, and then became the big fight, over, okay, well, how then do we live? How then do we move society forward? And, well, we're kind of in that period ourselves, right? About every 500 years, this kind of thing happens. There are these deep patterns, seasonality that God seems to engender in our world. Just when great blessings come in, it also creates great chaos. The only problem is, of course, that after about every 500 years where this has happened, it's been followed by seasons of great violence, and we can't really afford that right now that we've democratized the instruments of mass destruction and mass consumption, for that matter. We can no longer live life as we have known it, because living life as we have known it in the past will ultimately kill us. As we get more sophisticated every day in the art of mass destructive weapons, as we get more able to consume carbon-producing things in our world that create atmospheric changes as well. No, we're living certainly in a season of great danger, where we have this propensity to want to fight over our differences, and yet we have looming over our heads these possibilities of widespread destruction, where you look at human violence or climate change, either one. So it's a time, certainly, that is quite interesting. But if you believe in a God who actually exists, and you believe that this God is aware of us, maybe if you believe like me, that this God is even more aware of us than we're aware of us, and if you believe, despite perhaps the evidence, that you and I and all of us are loved beyond our wildest imagination, if you believe in these three things, then there's one thing you can't believe in. And that is that this God, that such a God, would sit up in the clouds at a time of great crisis saying, hey, let me know how it works out for y'all. You're on your own. Do it without me. That's not the God I know. I hope that's not the God you know. And if it is the God, that's the God you know, I hope I could be a little bit persuasive this morning. Now, I believe that God has been at work in our society for quite some time to help us meet the greatest crisis that human civilization has ever found. I think I would trace the earliest beginnings of where I'm looking at 150 years, but I'm not going to take 150 years of history with you this morning. But I will observe that at the 30,000-foot level, Western civilization has been built on what could be, in very broad, general, non-specific terms, be called male energy. Okay, now always got a lot of landmines whenever you talk about male or female energy, but the reality of it is we are male and female. Now, of course, there's a difference between your gendered body and what energy you may have. There's male energy, there's female energy that's been recognized by all the great world religions for thousands of years. How we present physically may be different from what the energy is we have inside us. So it's that you can't make a precise male and female kind of thing to it. But there is, in general, we built ourselves off of what could be called male energy, which is more about building and creating, and it tends to be more forward and aggressive. It tends to be about kind of bigger is better, and classify, and control. and some of these things can lead to obviously negative consequences. On the other hand, male energy itself is a sacred energy. It's not fundamentally evil at all. It's fundamentally godlike. And we must acknowledge, I think, to be accurate, that this energy, this basic assertive energy that could be generally called male, has built Western civilization to a very high degree. I mean, science itself and medicine is about controlling nature, right? I mean, we've built all kinds of medicines and therapeutics through control of nature, but we also know that certain forms of assertion of control of nature now are not good, and we've come to realize that. I think what's happened, though, sometime during the last century, that energy that built Western civilization that could be generally classified as male tipped to the other side and actually went to a female side of the energetic equation, such that people began to recognize either consciously or otherwise that we can no longer do like bigger is better, build, build, build. If we keep doing that, we will actually consume ourselves off the planet. We cannot simply control nature. We also need to learn how to live with nature. We cannot simply expand our borders and conquer those who are opposed to us. We need to live more collaboratively with those who are different from us. These kind of things. Again, there could be negative parts of this energy too, right? Both male and female have its counterparts. But basically, I think that this is part of how God is working to save human civilization right now, is through this tipping point that we've reached, tipping us into a different way of life, not to condemn the old way of life at all, but rather to help us fulfill a more holistic way of life. If that's a bit obscure to you, think about how this works in Taoism. Now, I don't expect you're all sophisticated practitioners of Taoism, but here is a world religion that has long recognized there are generally male and female energies, a yin, they call it yin and yang energies. And the way they see it, the divine energy is like this. It's not male or female, it's both. It's both combined. And so if you have a civilization that is primarily working on a male energetic plane, the solution, when it tips, it's not to say the male goes away, it actually fills out the other side. So it actually is an additive energy, not a subtractive one. And in fact, this little diagram that shows the kind of the yin, the yang, the dark and the light, notice how they both have dots in them. The white has a dark dot and the black has a white dot. That's to show that actually even in the purest form of female energy or the purest form of male energy, there's female energy in the male energy and male energy in the female energy. There's chocolate in the peanut butter and peanut butter in the chocolate in order to make a truly tasty human personality, right? You have to have both. If you don't, if that dot is taken away, that energy becomes chaotic. Male or female becomes chaotic and destructive. It needs the other within it as well. But if you want to me, what explains the chaos we're in, and especially that sense, have you noticed that people who are most wanting to burn things down and right the ship in whatever way, there is a sense of self-righteous indignation to those calls. Like, we are way better than them, and you've hurt me. I have the right. I am right. And now you're hurting me. You're threatening something I've been right about. I think part of that is because of this energetic flip. Literally, the things that were good and right the day before yesterday are no longer good and right in today's world. With climate change and more sophisticated technologies for warfare and so forth. Literally, many of the things that built Western civilization for good and right reasons we can no longer do. So it's like, well, there was a day when I could keep turning left. Well, now we have to turn right. Or there was a day when I keep turning right. Well, now we got to turn left in order to survive. Left or right is not bad. It's just different. We're in a different season. We have to recognize the seasonality of life. That the entire world works on seasons. If we don't get that about nature, we're really disconnected from nature. And that works the same in human society. So we have to recognize the season we're in and learn to live within it. Otherwise, literally, all hell breaks loose. No, especially when you try to eliminate that other side, that part which isn't you. I mean, it works as well in politics as it does between males and females, right? If you want to eliminate everything female within you or eliminate everything male within you, in those energies, it goes chaotic, it goes negative. Here's a little illustration from our Taoist friends. That male and female energy, the healthy kind, you look at the way they characterize of course, there's many differences of opinions in Taoism as there is Christianity, all right? So this is just a slim piece, but healthy female energy, they characterize as open, patient, caring, wise, flexible, compassionate. Healthy male energy is focused, disciplined, active, has a purpose, has a vision. Yet each one of those has this piece within it of the female energy. That's what makes it healthy. But unhealthy, if you take out that piece of the other side, female energy going from healthy to unhealthy becomes, in their characterization, lazy, unfocused, depressed, over-nurturing, unmotivated. Male energy becomes aggressive, narrow-minded, cold, and frustrated. You need the other in order to orient your own energy. Isn't it interesting, whether you agree with this characterization or not, how if you were going to put a political lens, which tends to corrupt almost everything, but put a political lens, how both sides of the political spectrum see the other side as this, right? Because both sides have eliminated the opposite energy, or doing their best to eliminate the opposite energy in their particular political domain. So they both become distinctively unhealthy and greatly chaotic and greatly destructive. We need both energies within us. We need to recognize that both exist as a whole and have a little bit of the other in ourselves in order to be fruitful in the way of God's kingdom. Well, whether I've characterized our society, the state we're in, correctly or not, there is one thing that both Ecclesiastes and Jesus say, they're very similar from these two passages. Ecclesiastes says, I know that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. And Jesus says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. In other words, whatever season we happen to be in, however you or I characterize the state of our society, there are certain things that are always true, that were true, are true now, and will be true well after we've left this earth. And for we as Christians, we turn to Jesus as an arbiter of truth. And what Jesus says, again, in and out of season, what we're called to do is love our enemies, pray for those who persecute you, do good to those who hate you. That's what we're called to do. That is the word of the Lord that endures forever, because we are all loved beyond our wildest imagination, not just those of us who sit here, not just those of us who are Republican or Democrat or independent or libertarian or whatever you are. We're all part of this human equation who God loves. And therefore, we're all part of the human equation who God has gifted. And if we are to avoid our fate either through massive violence or massive climate change, we're going to have to recognize that whether you vote for Donald Trump or you vote for whoever the Democratic candidate is, that we can't solve either one of these until we're holding hands with the very people we're opposing. Because the other side has a piece of this equation that is absolutely vital for our survival. We have to recognize that our enemies, or those who consider us to be their enemies, hold a piece of the puzzle that unites us and creates a way through the coming years. Will we recognize that and become part of the Jesus movement? Or will we fail to recognize this and become another form of zealotry? The choice is up to us. This is the part where God says, you know what, here's the plan. You choose. What part will you partake in this? This is now where you have complete agency. This is your choice. not God's. Which fruit do you desire to put into the world? Which fruit do you want to ripen? I believe that there is enough people in our society that genuinely resonate with the Jesus message, that genuinely see beyond the headlines of whatever newspaper you have to read, or whatever happens to be on Fox News or MSNBC, that are honestly aching for a better world than the one that we've been given right now. I could be wrong, but I do see a time coming when that level of saturation amongst those of us who are feeling so anxious and so helpless will find its pattern. A new pattern, a way that will lift human consciousness to a higher level, that will shift human civilization just slightly, just a degree or two, such that the longer time goes along, that society changes more and more in a different direction. I could be totally wrong, but right now I'm being totally honest. I believe in a God that has been at work with us for a very long time to meet this time. And what I see when I sit here is already that pattern emerging. I see people I know voted for Donald Trump in the last election, sitting next to people I know voted for Hillary Clinton in the last election. I see people here who are just absolutely furious about what Republicans are doing. I see people who are absolutely furious about what Democrats are doing. And yet we are all sitting here in the sanctuary together because somehow we've recognized that there's something higher that joins us. So intuitively we know this. Intellectually, it's just busting our brains apart. But intuitively we know this. And this congregation happens to sit on a campus where Jews, Christians, and Muslims are all gathered. These are three world religions who have been at odds with each other for millennia. Yet somehow we are here. Friends, we are touching that pattern of what God is trying to bring into the world. My hope, my faith, is that there will be a point where enough people are touching it, and it is made concrete enough that those of us who are not just us, but throughout our land, will find the pattern they need. Say, this is what I've been waiting for. This is who I am. I'm not this. And go and do what is done right here. Because whether you are Christian or not, the underlying pattern established in this meal is rock solid. When we face our enemies, just as Jesus faced those who considered him their enemies, Jesus did not raise up a sword and call people to act with violence against the Roman Empire. Instead, he showed the pattern that would literally save them if they so chose it. Those who seek to retain their life will lose it. Those who seek to give away their life in my name will save it. Friends, he said, this is my body which is broken for you. Do this as often as you eat of it in remembrance of me. So likewise, after supper, he took the cup, saying, this is the cup of the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink of it in remembrance of me. By eating this bread and drinking this cup, we remember Christ's death. We celebrate Christ's resurrection. And we come to see that pattern that is etched deeply in our own souls. That the power that seeks to save life always wins, even when its mortal life is taken. Love always wins. The only question is, which side do you choose to follow? The gifts of God for the people of God. I invite our servers to prepare the feast. And as they come forward, let us remind ourselves of who we are and whose we are. We are an inclusive, open, and affirming family of faith, welcoming all to God's table of love and acceptance. We are diverse, yet united by Christ's example. We care for one another, support one another, and challenge one another to become all that God creates us to be. We work together to nurture our community and to promote peace and justice in our conflicted world. You do not have to be